Personality, except he was known in the dance world.
Right.
Now, if you really want to be healthy here, you would, let's see, anytime you can use oppositional things that give you an oppositional pull, you can always be working on your body, whether you're pushing on your kitchen counter or anything. But if you can make, hey, let's get, those are dog bones from the store yesterday. I like to make straps. Everybody would love his straps. So if you sit there and it's just very helpful to posture to have it pull into your elbows. And then you go put you right in your core, put you right up into your nipples, and there you are, all wide awake instead of half asleep or at the computer. So you don't need to do it all the time, but you know, yours are a little shorter, that is still good. But you know, it's a great invitation to like a little kid would just start know how you
Right,
start
just
that.
play with it.
Now look at the edges here for the adductors. Now this is an original.
And this feels so good.
Yeah, this is a big
And it
massage.
takes you into...
And this is original size for Joe's Cadillac, and this is the padding that lets you have a hard enough edge that you can really use that edge.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we all need adductor work. Nobody is, you know, maybe if you were a professional prostitute, you'd be stretched there, but that was back in the days of the Bible, you know, and maybe still, but first profession women ever had, you know. What was that? It's part of God, because Mary Magdalene that was her profession. She was part of the chosen.
Well, here we are.
Yeah, again.
Once again.
The Cadillac's a wonderful place to live from. When I come in here alone and put on classical music, and my body just decides what we'll play with today and what we'll work on, and it decides it wherever it wants. And if you're in a tense place and you have music going and you're going to address that, the music is going to take you way farther into it, and it becomes a whole piece of work and almost a piece of art. And that I could get closest to joy is being on this alone with beautiful music.
Yeah.
And then the body is just happy.
It does, and then the springs take you.
But all the options you have on this machine is there's many more free options than you have on the Reformer.
Right.
And so it was favorite of Joe's, and it was a favorite of mine for sure, is the Cadillac. So, you know, when Kathy Grant I was going to her for 7 years at Henry Bendel's. She was up on the top floor behind the hairdressing salon. No windows, and nice parquet floor. She finally was asked to leave there because they wanted the whole space. And when someone closed or died, then I'd have to think, well now where do I go for my lessons? Because I insisted every time I would be in New York for 56 years to have a lesson for me. And so someone mentioned Bruce King. And I hadn't known of Bruce King. He had been the head of a dance company. And so he was in 73rd Street off the little park there. And I'd been there for years for a singing teacher. But he was in another building down the block. And it was one big room, and it had a bathroom, and that's it, one big room. That was his home. Little bit of a kitchen in the alcove. And when he went, he very formal, if there was ever a person you would say did classical or was classical, it was Bruce King. It was studied, it was perfect, it was repetitive, and always focused. And I had never seen him dance. And I saw a clip one time, I thought, oh my God, that is perfection. You know, he was going for perfection, and it was so stunning to see a whole intellect, a whole body. And I suppose that if your dancer would say, well, I know what that is. I would know it intellectually, but I don't think I'd seen it. I mean, we go now freer, we're more modern dance, and we admire the freedom of the body. His was studied to perfection. And he had injured himself in the knee, and he was, this was before he knew Joe, and he was told about this man, and as he told me the story, I went to Joe because of an injury, and he was used to dancers, so he put him on the reformer, and he gave him maybe 3 things to do, footwork for sure, but all to repattern the bones of his legs and feet, to get the perfect symmetry. And built in, not just known, built in.
Yes.
So he said for 6 months he was not allowed to do anything but about 3 exercises on the reformer. And it was very hard, you know, to just believe in that and stay with that. But it did. It gave him another bone understanding. And he's the one who wrote the book, The Rule of the Bones.
I have it.
Yeah.
I have his
That
original
little
book. Yeah.
And that book, you know, his philosophy was, if your bones are in the right order, and your muscles will follow. And that's where you start from. And we go back to being skeletons unless we're going to be burned. You know, you have a choice. But when you feel, I don't know whether he taught me this, but somewhere I learned that if you let your bones go as heavy into gravity as you can, you're going to float right out of them. It's almost like your spirit ascends, and the body organizes itself out of the bones. You can feel it.
Yes.
And mostly we keep our attention, we don't relax the bones.
Yes.
So it's good to just speak to your bone. Can you let go of bone? Can you and then talk to your body as much as you can and ask. And only one person that I know now and work with some has no tension. You know, you have to give her tension and keep her in structure. Most of us are hypertense.
So is that something that you feel in working with him that really contributed to you beginning to get more of a sense of your own grounding?
Well, when I was with him, I started with Kathy Grant when I was 50, and then until 1957. I was 57. In 57, I started with Bruce because I couldn't work with Kathy. She was out of the studio, and you went up the elevator and you went down a hall, and he greeted you at the door, and Mr. Peach was there with him to greet you. Mr. Peach was a small little poodle, and everything that Bruce did, Mr. Peach accompanied him in. And as you're doing your leg work and he starts you out in a very formal way, he sits there or stands there and Mr. Peach beside him. So that there were the two of them always focused on you. And Mr. Peach was peach colored.
Wow.
And lovely little poodle.
Yeah.
So that I think was probably, I usually go 7 years with a person. And he died in 5 years of AIDS, of the kind of into all the endocrine system, so there was no way to not die. But Bruce was a gay man, and there was a time in the 1970s when, or the 80s especially, where you better not be active sexually, or that's when most of them contracted it. Yeah. And he began to have the sore mouth that you couldn't get over, but you know, he was so healthy that he could beat that back. But he really was, maybe in sync with his death and where he felt the culture was, because he felt the dignity, the finesse, all the elegance of life in America was going away. It was dying out, and what was happening to the idea of gayness, at least in New York City and in the collective, was like Harvey Fierstein, just broad humor and queening it, and he was not at all that way. To him, that was not funny. He couldn't even laugh at it.
Yeah.
That was a diminishment of who he was, what he was, and the spirituality around it. So he was a profoundly serious man. He was a sensate thinker, as Joe was, only Joe was extroverted, Bruce was introverted, and he never talked about himself. He was just doing the moment, and he was the most repetitive man, more repetitive, exquisitely repetitive than Joe. Joe was generally repetitive. You all needed to do all his stuff, but it was on point all the time with Bruce, and it was like Joe in that he didn't care who you were. He would mix up what your name was. You were a body coming in that he was going to try to improve.
Right.
And where you were in your life, whether you were happy, sad, he could care less. This was a piece of work with your bones and your feet and your legs and whatever you were dressing, and that's
You were there to be sculpted.
I think that's the only man I would say was classical. There's no other that I ever met. Never a teacher other than that. And he wouldn't. But that's how refined he was in the work. And when I went, I was also, Tuesday I was going to lesson with Bruce. Wednesday, after I finished seeing my psychoanalytic clients, I would go to Jean-Claude West and get the new cutting edge of everything new. And at that point, physical therapy was beginning now to be combined into the Pilates method. And Jean-Claude was with Marc Molnar, and they were working on this too. So I wanted this stuff. This was very good. And I trained Jean-Claude in the method up in Northampton. So he knew the method, and then he was such an intellect. He went to the universities. He went to NYU, I think, and he just did all the anatomy and the biomechanics, and that he wanted to know. He was a thinker, and so he and Anna Schmitz, his wife, went over to Bruce. I said he's very interesting, and they went over there, and probably 2 or 3 weeks they fled. They could not stand the repetition and the keeping to a pattern, every time the same. This was classical, and they were too much in the creative place, an inventive place. But I was, by then, 57. By 50, I began to understand what sensate is, and it's repetition. It's a love for structure, and with what I was born as, with intuition, what's another way to look at it. Let's look at it another way. Always a new way. Always a new way. So repetition was an anathema, and even in starting with Joe, after you're taught the forms, you're set free on that floor. So you teach yourself from then on. And there was a form, on the mat work, and especially the mat work where you went first to the reformer, then to the mat, and I couldn't stand that you had to do this after this. My intuitiveness was just and so I did it other ways around, or I do it backwards to front, and I just do the things, but and every time different. Joe didn't mind that. He didn't mind that. He didn't teach you anymore. He eyeballed you, and Clara eyeballed you, and if you were stuck, they'd come and give you a little hint. But when I did something brand new, that's what I can say that most people do not know, because Romana, saying she had it, and I don't know, it was quite a while back before that she'd been with him, before I was with him, but she would say, if I got inventive, say, on the Cadillac, which was way down the end of her studio, and she'd be all the way up front by the windows, I'd be doing my little new thing. That's not Pilates. And I say, where is she? she had eyes all, and that there you did not invent.
But Joseph Pilates let you invent.
Pilates would see you invent and say, "That's good. Just be sure you're using your whole body. That the whole body is in on this," and that I think is totally his main brilliance. That with him you stay long enough with the work, you're integrated, and most exercise you go for this place or that place, and you want to look differently somewhere, and he was never about how you looked and whether you would be beautiful or not, or he just accepted everybody as a piece of work, and it was very democratic. There was no kowtowing to the rich or anything, which you got at Romana's, but she had to be supported. Somebody was supporting Joe, probably some rich people always would be supporting, because it didn't ring $5, and then it went up to $7.
Wow.
And that was from 1959 to about 1966, and then he stopped working because he was too ill. And
let's just pause for a second. Well, actually, with Bruce, let's go over and show the ladder that you have. That's his, and I'd like to kind of ask you about. I mean, did he create the ladder? Was that his creation?
I don't think so. I think dance studios always had a ladder. But let me finish with his personality.
Okay.
Because then we'll go to the way he worked.
Beautiful.
There was more rigidity in Bruce than there was in Joe. But Joe became alcoholic, and that made expense things. But he commanded his studio, and you were in his space. And there came a time when someone, I don't know how he knew about this big white boxer dog, was going to be put down, and his name was Champ. Big, tall dog, thin and tall, and he saved that dog by bringing it into his studio and making it his dog. So then you came and you were greeted at the door by Mr. Peach and Champ. Well, this began to be, I love animals. This could be a frolic. Not in Bruce's studio, you see. But sometimes they knew that I might have a bone, and then there were dances and all, and he was not saying what he thought yet, Bruce. But at one point, the dancing dogs was a bit much, and this one day he said, if you continue to bring this to my dogs, I will ask you not to come anymore, because he didn't want any. He was boss of that space. No distraction, and the dogs obeyed him. And so you came in, and then the dog goes to the big cushion, and so little Mr. Peach and Champ would go, and they were not so much right there. Champ was never right there. Mr. Peach had always been right there. So that day, when he really just smacked me down for bringing anything to feed his dogs, that day, in doing the long spine stretch on the reformer, where your feet are free in the air, at some point, because I was used to where he would be, I was amiss. I was not in total control, and I hurt my spine. And he would always be sort of with the feet, and I don't know, something distracted me, and I was hurt. And I said, Bruce, I've done something with my spine. He paid absolutely no attention to me. And when I went home from that day, I thought, I'm not going to go to Bruce ever again if when I feel injured he does not attend to it. So I guess either we talked on the phone or I wrote him a note. And on the same day, we made, the bottom line was reached. No more feeding the dogs, no more not being interested in some symptom I'm telling you about. And we were even again.
Yeah.
That's the way he could be negotiated with. But it took a lot to bring his attention to you. And I mean, in that way, he was a generalist. That's the only way. Because he was not so interested in you as an individual. It's just the body. That way, he was like Joe. Yeah. And one day, he had me doing an exercise, and he began to talk about his life over where he lived on the floor with Joe in their building. And he had a little apartment in the back of that building, and he was very, very fond of Clara. They were very good buddies. And there were the three of them. Hannah had a room, and Joe and Clara had the big front room. It was made into just one big room was where they lived. The bathroom was down the hall. This was very simple living. And he knows me now. He just said, and boy, did they fight at night. Well, who fought at night? He said, Joe and Hannah. What do you mean, Joe and Hannah? Well, Hannah was his mistress. That was so dumbfounding to me. Hannah was a very kind of butch, and she dressed sort of butch, and her muscles were more male than looking than female, and you would have never thought her as anybody's mistress. And yes, he said, and evidently she really could match him too. They're all Germans, and that was I got that news. The only one who got that news, and it was just natural to Joe, to Bruce. It was a part of just what was. And then you saw it. Then I'd been there 6.5 years, twice a week. These three people every day together, and then living together in the same building. This was a family, and they were all teachers of Pilates in the work, and the two women had serviced the man, and one was beyond it, worn out probably, and very happy to have Hannah on board. I'm sure because they're really truly fond of each other. There was no tension in that room, and if you're intuitive, you would have picked that up. So I just say, you could never judge anything. Don't ever judge anybody's sexual relationships, because that worked so well. And that's the end of his life, the last years of his life, when he was not womanizing as people knew he could and would. But, and then he said, yes, and they had in Beckett, they had a little cottage, and they would go up there after work Friday. First Clara would go up, so she had a car, I guess, and Hannah must have had a car. And she would clean the house and make a lovely dinner, the wife, or it wasn't the wife, we know they never married, but the number one. And then Hannah and Joe would arrive, on a date, sort of, and you thought, oh, holy smokes, I said, you would not get an American woman to allow that. But that they were very, very special. And when Joe died, Hannah and Clara tried to maintain the studio.
When did Bruce die?
Bruce died in around 1993 or
later,
2. 1993 or 2, yeah. And when Clara died in 1977, 10 years after Joe, she gave Bruce one of her cherished possessions, her comforter from her bed. I mean, so little did they have, but I mean, that she cherished Bruce.
Yes.
Yeah.
Special.
So, then the other thing to say about him, he was getting ill. He was, he never complained except that you'd see he was in some pain. And I sent him one of my clients to work with him. It was exactly his type. Sensei thinker. And neither one of them had an idea that the greater part of them lay in the unconscious, and nor did Joe, that they needed to really work through their heart place, through their feeling, move move that way. I think that Bruce probably did, because he could be self-confident enough in himself, and his older lovers came round with new lovers. I mean, they were relationships. These were not just one-nighters,
Right.
you know. And I lost my point. Stop for a minute, Michael. Let me choose.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
coming to.
That
toward
I
the end.
introduced her, and with her he conversed. They were two like people. She was sort of a boyish girl.
And who was that?
One of my clients.
Your client.
And they made. He would be personal with someone just like him. He had no idea what to do with his opposite, with an intuitive feeler, maybe as some of his lovers had been, but he had no idea where you were coming from. And that didn't ever matter when you were a student of a teacher, because you were getting what they knew that you didn't know yet. And yet now I would never expect that I would just be me, and that every client who would come in I would expect that they could understand me, and I would just be me, and not try to fathom, well, where are they? You know, it's so different, so different. But she's the one who wrote his obituary, and he knew he would be dying, and he told her everything to say, and he'd had vast experience in the dance world, and he did good as a benefactor for young dancers who had no little kids. Lots of wonderful things he did, mostly I think in New Jersey. But he was first one probably before Ron Fletcher, that Clara would ask, please could you take the studio after Joe? And he had too much of his own work. Ron had his own company, and they couldn't find him. And I don't know, maybe they asked Robert Fitzgerald, but I think they were closer to Ron and Bruce.
Right.
And they just struggled along, and they couldn't, because without Joe, people fell away. I had already not been able to take lessons, so I was already going now to Bob Seed. And then Hannah fell in love with someone, and married and disappeared into New England, and we lost Hannah. Nobody knows what name she took her, and she escaped. She was the workhorse of that studio, and probably with Joe too, you could say. Yeah. I mean, she was strong. Yeah. But I just thought those are like character traits. And his memory of me was when he was quite ill, and he would talk to the one I sent to. He said, well, the one that always brings me the chocolates.